I realized I had become invisible the moment my own daughter-in-law looked straight through me on Christmas Eve, smiled at everyone else in the room, and acted as though I had never walked through the front door. For a few seconds, I honestly wondered if I had somehow imagined the invitation. I stood there holding a carefully wrapped gift basket with both hands while snowflakes slowly melted across the shoulders of my camel-colored wool coat. The cold outside had followed me into the grand foyer, but somehow it felt warmer than the welcome waiting inside. The right home glowed with everything Christmas was supposed to be. Garland wrapped around the staircase. White lights shimmered across the windows. A 12-foot Fraser fir stood proudly in the living room, decorated with crystal ornaments that reflected the fireplace like tiny stars. The smell of cinnamon, roasted turkey, fresh baked rolls, and pine needles floated through the house, mixing into the familiar scent that always reminded me of family gatherings from years ago. I had spent nearly 2 weeks choosing gifts for everyone. Mary loved watercolor painting, so I found a professional set from an art store downtown. Jaden had once mentioned wanting a leather-bound edition of Theodore Roosevelt's speeches, so I searched 3 bookstores before finding a beautiful copy. Even Avery received a silk scarf I had ordered months in advance because she'd admired that exact color during a shopping trip the previous spring. I still believed thoughtful gifts mattered, even when thoughtful words had become rare. I quietly closed the front door behind me, brushed the snow from my sleeves, and waited for someone to notice I had arrived. Nobody did. Avery laughed at something one of her friends had said while arranging charcuterie boards on the kitchen island. Jaden carried another stack of plates toward the dining room without lifting his eyes from his phone. Their neighbors chatted comfortably beside the fireplace. Christmas music floated softly through hidden speakers. Everyone belonged to the evening except me. I finally cleared my throat just enough to announce my presence without interrupting anyone. Jaden glanced over for only a second. "Hi, Mom," he said with a distracted smile before immediately returning to another conversation. It wasn't unkind. Somehow, that made it hurt even more. Avery looked directly at me next. Her blue eyes met mine for the briefest moment. Then she smiled politely at the guests standing behind me and walked away as though I had been part of the wallpaper. "Can someone help me with the dessert table?" she asked loudly. 3 people answered. I wasn't one of them. I stood frozen for another heartbeat before carefully setting the gifts beneath the towering Christmas tree. There wasn't a name tag waiting for me. Every other present had one. Mine simply disappeared into the growing pile, anonymous among dozens of brightly wrapped boxes. I reminded myself not to overthink it. Families became busy during the holidays. Hosting guests was stressful. Maybe Avery hadn't seen me. Maybe Jaden was distracted by work. Maybe I was letting loneliness invent problems that weren't really there. Those explanations had comforted me before. They felt much weaker now. Mary came downstairs carrying a tray of hot chocolate mugs. At 16, she had grown taller than I remembered from Thanksgiving, her chestnut ponytail bouncing gently as she hurried across the room. She noticed me immediately. "Grandma," she said with genuine warmth before carefully setting the tray onto a side table. She wrapped both arms around me without hesitation. That single hug accomplished what no expensive decoration inside the house could. It reminded me I still existed. "I'm so happy you're here," she whispered. "Me too," I answered softly, although the words felt heavier than they should have. Before Mary could say anything else, Avery called across the room. "Mary, sweetheart, could you help me upstairs?" Her tone remained perfectly pleasant. Mary hesitated, looking from her mother back to me. "I'll be right back, Grandma." I smiled. "Take your time." She disappeared upstairs, leaving me standing alone again. I wandered toward the dining room where a magnificent holiday table stretched nearly 12 feet beneath sparkling chandeliers. Fine china. Crystal glasses. Gold napkin. Rings. Every place setting carried a handwritten name card. I slowly followed each one around the table. Eric Johnson. Jaden Wright. Avery Wright. Mary Wright. Friends. Neighbors. Business associates. Every seat had a name except mine. At first I assumed it had simply been misplaced. I checked again. Then once more. My chair had been tucked quietly against the wall beside a serving cabinet, without silverware, without a plate, without a card. Almost as though someone expected me to stand if extra space became necessary. I didn't say a word. After nearly 70 years of life, I'd learned that silence often revealed more than confrontation ever could. I gently placed my purse beneath the lonely chair and looked around the room one last time. That's when I noticed Eric Johnson, my late husband's longtime attorney and closest friend, watching everything from the opposite end of the hallway. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't speaking. He simply met my eyes for a long, thoughtful moment, glanced toward the unfinished place settings, and then slowly slipped a sealed ivory envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket. I quietly stepped away from the dining room before anyone could notice I had been studying the table. The Christmas music continued drifting through the house as if everything were perfectly normal. Bing Crosby sang about a white Christmas while glasses clinked together and laughter echoed from the living room. I carried the same calm expression I had practiced for years, the one that reassured everyone I was perfectly fine even when I was not. It had become almost second nature after losing my husband, Harold, 4 years earlier. Grief had taught me that people eventually became uncomfortable with sadness, so I learned to carry mine silently. I wandered into the kitchen and found an empty corner beside the coffee station. From there I could see nearly the entire first floor without drawing attention to myself. Avery moved confidently from guest to guest, making introductions, complimenting outfits, checking on appetizers, and making certain every detail looked effortless. She was undeniably good at hosting. No one outside the family would ever imagine that the same woman who remembered every guest's favorite wine could somehow forget where her own mother-in-law was supposed to sit. I poured myself a cup of coffee, hoping the warmth would settle the uneasy feeling growing inside my chest. Before I could take my first sip, I overheard 2 neighbors standing only a few feet away. "Avery really has everything under control," one woman said. "She practically runs this family now." The other laughed softly. "She certainly does. It almost feels like the house belongs to her." Neither comment was cruel by itself. Still, something about the confidence in those words lingered with me. Harold had built this home from the ground up more than 30 years ago. We had planted every maple tree together. We had chosen every window, every brick, every light fixture. Yet listening to those conversations, I realized how easily history could disappear when nobody bothered to tell it anymore. A few minutes later Avery entered the kitchen carrying a silver serving tray. She stopped when she noticed me standing near the coffee maker. For just a moment I thought she might apologize for the missing seat or ask if I needed anything. Instead she smiled politely. "Anna, would you mind bringing these bread baskets into the dining room? I am trying to keep everything moving." Her tone sounded pleasant enough that anyone listening would have thought she was including me. But I noticed something else. Every other guest had been chatting, relaxing, or enjoying the holiday. I had quietly become part of the staff. "Of course," I answered. I picked up the baskets and carried them into the dining room, carefully placing them exactly where they belonged. Nobody looked up. Nobody thanked me. The conversation never paused. As I turned back toward the kitchen, I caught Eric Johnson watching me again. This time his expression carried something I could not quite identify. It was not pity. It looked more like concern mixed with careful observation. He gave the slightest nod before looking away as another guest approached him. That tiny gesture stayed with me much longer than it should have. Eric had attended nearly every major family gathering since Harold passed away, always insisting he simply enjoyed spending the holidays with old friends and checking in on the family. At the time, none of us thought much of it. Looking back, I realized I had stopped questioning his quiet presence years ago. I returned to the living room where Mary was arranging presents beneath the tree. She quietly slid over to make room beside her. "Grandma," she whispered, making certain no one else could hear, "did Mom forget your place at dinner?" Children often notice what adults pretend not to see. I smiled gently and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Sometimes holidays become busy. Mary frowned. No. Mom planned this dinner for almost a month. She wrote every name card herself. Her words landed with surprising weight. Suddenly the missing place card no longer felt like an accident. Before I could respond, Avery called Mary's name from across the room again. Sweetheart, I need you upstairs. Mary reluctantly stood. As she walked away, she glanced back at me with worried eyes. That single look confirmed something I had quietly resisted admitting to myself. I was not imagining any of this. The realization settled over me slowly, like fresh snow covering familiar ground until everything looked different. I sat alone near the fireplace while guests exchanged stories and admired the decorations. A family friend handed me a plate of cheese and crackers, assuming I had simply chosen the quiet chair in the corner. I thanked him warmly because kindness, even accidental kindness, deserved appreciation. Across the room Jaden laughed at one of his business partner's jokes. For a brief moment our eyes met. His smile faded ever so slightly. He noticed where I was sitting. He noticed that I was alone. He opened his mouth as though he intended to come over. Avery gently touched his arm and whispered something into his ear. Almost immediately he nodded and turned back toward the conversation. I looked down at the untouched crackers in my hands. I could not hear what Avery had said, but somehow it had been enough to change his mind. A few minutes later everyone was invited into the dining room. Chairs slid across hardwood floors. As guests found their assigned seats, I remained standing beside the wall, uncertain whether someone would eventually realize there had been a mistake. Then Avery looked directly at me and smiled. Anna, would you mind waiting just a little longer? We are one chair short, so we are going to seat the children first. We will figure something out in a minute. Her words sounded perfectly reasonable. Several guests nodded without questioning them. But I had counted the chairs earlier. There had been exactly enough for every invitation that had been sent. Somewhere behind the conversations and holiday music, Johnson slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket again, rested his hand on the same sealed ivory envelope, and looked toward me with an expression that suggested the evening was unfolding exactly as he had expected. The dining room slowly filled with conversation as every chair found its guest. Crystal glasses caught the glow of candlelight while holiday music drifted softly from the next room. I remained standing near the serving cabinet with my hands folded in front of me, careful not to make anyone uncomfortable. One by one, plates were placed on the table. One by one, guests unfolded their linen napkins. Nobody asked why I was still standing. That silence said more than words ever could. Avery glanced toward me with the same polished smile she had worn all evening. Anna, thank you for being so understanding, she said warmly enough that several guests smiled in my direction. We had a few unexpected changes, but we will make you comfortable in just a minute. It sounded thoughtful. It even sounded generous. Yet I remembered counting every chair only minutes earlier. Nothing about this evening had happened by accident. I quietly nodded. Do not worry about me. My voice surprised even me. It remained steady, almost peaceful. Years ago Harold used to tell me that dignity was something no one could take unless I handed it over myself. Standing there alone, I silently repeated those words. Across the table Jaden shifted uneasily in his seat. He glanced toward the empty space beside the wall where I waited, then looked down at his plate again. His discomfort was obvious now, but discomfort without action changes very little. I did not blame him entirely. Sometimes people convince themselves that avoiding conflict is kindness, when in reality it only allows hurt to continue. Dinner began with prayer. Avery thanked everyone for celebrating together and spoke about family, gratitude, and creating memories that would last forever. The irony almost made me smile. As everyone lifted their glasses, Mary quietly looked over her shoulder at me instead of joining the toast immediately. She seemed to be waiting for someone else to notice what she already had. Nobody did. Halfway through the meal, another small moment settled heavily into my heart. A neighbor complimented the homemade cranberry sauce. Avery accepted the praise graciously. "It has always been one of my specialties," she said with a laugh. I lowered my eyes toward my untouched hands. That recipe had belonged to Harold's mother. She had taught it to me during my very first Christmas after our wedding, and I had prepared it every single year since then. Even the handwritten recipe card still sat inside my kitchen drawer with faded red stains along one corner. I did not interrupt. I did not correct her. But something inside me quietly acknowledged another piece of the picture. Traditions had not disappeared. They had simply changed owners. As the meal continued, conversation shifted toward vacation plans, business investments, and home renovations. Someone asked Jaden how long they planned to stay in the house. Before he could answer, Avery spoke confidently. "Honestly, I think this is where we will spend the rest of our lives. It finally feels like our home." The words hung in the air longer than anyone realized. Our home. Not Harold's dream. Not the place where Jaden grew up. Not the house where every Christmas ornament carried a memory. Our home. I noticed Eric Johnson pause with his fork halfway to his mouth. He did not say anything, but his eyes briefly met mine again. This time there was no uncertainty in his expression. He was paying attention to every word. That realization sent an unexpected chill through me. Why was Harold's attorney observing this dinner so carefully? I had known Eric for more than 30 years. He never attended social gatherings without a reason. If he was here tonight, something important was unfolding beneath the surface, even if I could not yet see it. A few minutes later, Mary quietly excused herself from the table and walked toward me carrying a small dessert plate. "Grandma," she whispered, placing a slice of pie into my hands, "I saved this before it was gone." Her cheeks turned slightly pink as she lowered her voice even further. "I heard Mom telling the caterer this afternoon that one extra place setting was not necessary." My heart did not race. It simply became very still. I looked at Mary carefully. Children rarely invent details like that. They simply repeat what they have heard. For the first time all evening, every remaining doubt disappeared. I had not been forgotten. I had been planned around. Before I could answer, Avery called from the dining room. "Mary, sweetheart, everyone is opening presents after dessert." Mary squeezed my hand gently before returning to the table. I watched her walk away, grateful that kindness still existed somewhere inside this family. I slowly tasted the pie she had brought me. It was sweet, warm, and strangely comforting. Harold used to say that truth arrived quietly. It never needed to announce itself because eventually it became impossible to ignore. As if echoing that thought, Eric rose from his chair after dessert ended. He adjusted the cuffs of his gray jacket and reached calmly into the inside pocket where the sealed ivory envelope had rested all evening. Instead of sitting back down with everyone else, he cleared his throat and said, "Before the gifts are opened, there is something Harold instructed me to address at this exact Christmas gathering." Every conversation in the room stopped at once, and Avery's confident smile slowly began to fade. Eric waited until every conversation had faded into complete silence before removing the ivory envelope from his jacket. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked slowly around the dining room, making eye contact with each member of the family as though confirming that everyone who needed to hear what came next was finally present. I remained beside the wall with my dessert plate still resting in my hands. Somehow I felt that moving now would interrupt something much larger than an ordinary Christmas gathering. Avery recovered her smile first. "Eric, you are always full of surprises," she said lightly. "Should we wait until after everyone opens presents?" Her voice carried the effortless confidence she had displayed all evening, but I noticed the slightest tension in her shoulders. Eric answered with the calm patience that had made him one of the most respected attorneys in our county. "No, Avery. Harold left very specific instructions. He wanted these remarks delivered before any gifts were exchanged." Jaden leaned back in his chair, looking genuinely confused. "Dad planned something for Christmas?" Eric nodded once. "Several years ago." No one spoke after that. The room felt smaller than it had an hour earlier. Even the fire seemed quieter. Eric carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded several neatly typed pages. I recognized Harold's signature at the bottom before Eric even began reading. My heart tightened. I had not seen my husband's handwriting in months. Eric cleared his throat. "These are not changes to the will," he said. "They are personal instructions that accompany a family trust established before Harold passed away." I noticed several guests exchange curious glances. Avery relaxed almost immediately, perhaps believing this was simply one of Harold's sentimental holiday messages. She reached for her wine glass with an easy smile. Then Eric continued. Harold believed that money should never be separated from character. He instructed me to observe certain family interactions over time before activating the final stage of the trust. My eyes lifted toward Eric. Observe. The word echoed inside my mind. Suddenly every glance he had given me throughout the evening made sense. He had not been attending dinner as a guest. He had been watching. Across the table, Jaden frowned. What exactly does that mean? Eric folded his hands calmly over the document. It means that tonight is one of several observations your father asked me to make over the past 4 years. The room became noticeably quieter. Even guests who barely knew our family sensed the atmosphere changing. Avery laughed softly, although it sounded less natural than before. Harold always liked making things dramatic. Eric did not smile. Harold disliked drama. He valued evidence. Those 4 words settled heavily over the table. I looked toward the Christmas tree glowing in the next room, remembering the countless evenings Harold and I had spent discussing the importance of kindness after guests had gone home. He often said that people revealed themselves not during celebrations but in the quiet moments when they believed nobody important was paying attention. At the time I thought he was simply reflecting on life. I never imagined he had built those beliefs into legal documents. Eric continued reading. Harold had written about gratitude, responsibility, and preserving the family rather than simply preserving wealth. His words sounded exactly as I remembered his voice. Warm. Thoughtful. Patient. Several guests smiled while listening. Mary's eyes quietly filled with tears. Halfway through the letter Eric paused and adjusted his glasses. The remaining section, he said carefully, contains private instructions regarding the future administration of the Wright Family Trust. Before I continue, I want everyone to understand that these instructions were drafted voluntarily, reviewed repeatedly, and executed according to all legal requirements. Avery slowly lowered her wine glass onto the table. The smile she had worn throughout the evening no longer reached her eyes. Jaden looked from Eric to me and then back again, as though trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly seemed much larger than he had realized. I felt no excitement. Only curiosity. Harold had never made decisions impulsively. If he had planned something years ago, he had done so for a reason. Eric looked directly at me for only a moment before returning to the pages. It was a respectful glance, almost asking permission to continue. I answered with the smallest nod. My husband had trusted him. That was enough for me. Eric resumed reading. Harold instructed that no individual should receive final authority over the trust solely because of family title or marriage. Instead, that responsibility would be determined after evaluating whether the values upon which this family was built had been honored. I heard someone quietly set down a fork in the otherwise silent room. Avery shifted slightly in her chair. Her confidence had begun to crack in almost invisible ways that only someone watching closely could detect. She crossed her arms, then immediately uncrossed them. She glanced toward Jaden, perhaps expecting reassurance, but he remained focused entirely on Eric. The attorney slowly turned to the final page and rested one finger beneath a paragraph without reading it aloud. He looked around the room one last time before speaking in an unusually measured voice. Harold instructed me that before I reveal the identity of the individual entrusted with final authority over the family trust, I must first place one question on the record. He stopped, folded the pages together for a brief moment, and then looked directly at Avery as he said, "Mrs. Wright, would you please explain why Anna was not given a place at tonight's Christmas table? For the first time that evening, Avery did not answer immediately. The silence that followed Eric's question seemed to stretch across the entire dining room. Every guest looked from him to Avery, waiting for what everyone assumed would be a simple explanation. Avery let out a small laugh that sounded more rehearsed than natural. I think there has been a misunderstanding, she said, carefully smoothing the front of her red dress. We had a last-minute seating issue. I already explained that. Eric remained perfectly still. I heard your explanation, he replied. That is not what I asked. His voice never rose. It did not need to. I asked why Anna was not given a place at the table. Avery looked toward Jaden as if expecting him to step in, but he appeared just as unsettled as everyone else. Eric, Jaden said carefully, if this is about a missing chair, we can fix that right now. The chair is not the issue, Eric answered. The decision is. The room became silent once again. I stood. Exactly where I had been all evening, holding myself as calmly as I could. I did not feel angry anymore. Instead, I found myself wondering whether Harold had somehow anticipated this very moment years before he passed away. Avery folded her hands together. Anna has always preferred quieter spaces during family gatherings. I thought she would be more comfortable. I almost smiled at those words because they sounded so reasonable to anyone who had not lived the last several years with our family. Eric slowly removed a small leather notebook from inside his jacket. Interesting, he said. Would you like me to read my observations from Thanksgiving 2 years ago, Easter last year, Mother's Day, and today's Christmas gathering? Avery's confident expression flickered for just an instant. She had not expected records. Neither had I. Eric opened the notebook with practiced care. Thanksgiving. Anna's assigned seat removed before guests arrived. Easter. Family portrait taken without inviting Anna into the photograph until after the primary pictures were finished. Mother's Day. Brunch reservation made for 7 despite 8 confirmed attendees, resulting in Anna eating separately after another table became available. Christmas Eve. No place card prepared although every invited guest received one. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted him. The words landed gently, one after another, yet each one carried the weight of undeniable truth. Jaden slowly turned toward Avery. Is that true? She immediately shook her head. It sounds much worse when you list isolated moments like that. None of it was intentional. Eric closed the notebook. Patterns are rarely isolated. Those 4 words lingered in the room. Mary quietly lowered her eyes. I could tell from her expression that she remembered every one of those occasions. So did I. I had simply spent years convincing myself they were accidents because believing otherwise would have been far more painful. I remembered standing outside family photographs while someone said there was not enough room. I remembered eating after everyone else because another chair needed to be found. I remembered returning home each time telling myself that next holiday would be different. Somewhere along the way, hope had become a habit instead of a prediction. Eric looked toward me with quiet respect. Anna, did Harold ever tell you the final condition attached to the family trust? I slowly shook my head. No. He believed you would explain it if the time ever came. Eric nodded. That is exactly what he instructed me to do. Several guests leaned forward without realizing it. Even those who barely knew our family understood that something significant was about to be revealed. Eric unfolded the final page once more. The Wright Family Trust currently holds assets valued at approximately $80 million, including investments, commercial properties, charitable endowments, and the family residence. A soft murmur spread across the room before disappearing almost immediately. I had known Harold was financially successful, but hearing the current value spoken aloud still surprised me. Eric continued before anyone could interrupt. Harold believed wealth should protect the values of a family rather than replace them. Therefore, no individual would receive final authority over the trust until I determined whether those values remained intact. Avery slowly straightened in her chair. Her expression shifted from discomfort to cautious optimism, as though she still believed this announcement would ultimately benefit her and Jaden. After all, they had managed the household for years. Perhaps she assumed they would naturally inherit responsibility. Eric carefully placed the document back onto the table. Before I reveal Harold's chosen successor, there is one final section that must be entered into the record exactly as written. He paused long enough for every eye in the room to settle on him again. Then he read in Harold's unmistakable words, "The individual entrusted with protecting everything I built must first demonstrate that they know how to protect the one person who stood beside me while I built it." Eric lowered the page without saying another word, and every person at that table instinctively turned to look at me. The room remained completely still. No one spoke after Eric finished reading Harold's words. I felt dozens of eyes resting on me, yet I had never wanted attention less. I would have traded every curious glance in that room for one more ordinary Christmas with my husband sitting beside me. Harold had never cared about grand entrances or dramatic gestures. If he had written those instructions, he had done it to protect something he believed was quietly slipping away long before anyone else noticed. Jaden slowly pushed his chair back from the table. His face carried the confusion of a son who had just discovered that his father had been fighting a battle without ever telling him. "Eric," he said carefully, "are you saying my father expected something like this to happen?" Eric answered without hesitation. "Harold hoped it never would." Hope and preparation are not the same thing. Jaden lowered his eyes. That simple sentence seemed to weigh heavily on him. Avery forced a polite smile that looked noticeably strained now. "This is becoming much larger than it needs to be," she said. "Anna knows I have always respected her." I looked toward her quietly. I wanted very much to believe those words. Unfortunately, respect is measured by patterns rather than speeches. Eric folded the documents neatly before placing them on the table. "Respect is demonstrated through ordinary moments," he replied. "Who is welcomed? Who is remembered? Who is invited to belong? Those moments often reveal more than celebrations themselves." Nobody challenged him. Even the guests who had arrived expecting nothing more than a pleasant holiday dinner now seemed to understand they had witnessed something deeply personal. Mary slowly stood from her chair and walked across the room toward me. She slipped her hand into mine without saying a word. I gently squeezed her fingers. Her quiet kindness reminded me that compassion often survives even when families lose their way. Eric watched the two of us for a moment before continuing. "Harold also instructed me never to make assumptions. He wanted facts." He reached into his briefcase, which had remained beside his chair all evening, and removed a slim folder. "Over the past 4 years I have visited this family on birthdays, holidays, charity events, and casual dinners. Sometimes I announced my visit. Sometimes I simply stopped by for coffee." Jaden looked surprised. "I remember those visits." Eric nodded. "You should. They were never social calls." Avery shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Surely you are not suggesting every family gathering was some sort of examination?" "No," Eric answered calmly. "Life itself was the examination. I merely observed it." Those words settled over the room with quiet finality. Suddenly I understood why Eric had occasionally asked me gentle questions after family events. He never encouraged complaints. He simply listened. At the time I believed he was checking on an old friend. Now I realized Harold had entrusted him with something far more significant. A business associate sitting near the end of the table finally spoke. "Harold always struck me as a thoughtful man." Eric offered a respectful smile. "He was. He also believed wealth without integrity eventually destroys the very family it intends to help." The guest nodded thoughtfully and said nothing more. Avery looked toward Jaden again, searching for support. "You know I have worked incredibly hard for this family," she said. "Everything I have done has been for our future." Jaden answered more quietly than I had ever heard him speak. "I know how hard you have worked." Then he hesitated before adding, "But I also cannot remember the last time Mom sat beside us during Christmas dinner." His words hung in the air. He was not accusing anyone. He was simply acknowledging a truth that had finally become impossible to ignore. I felt no satisfaction hearing him say it. Only sadness that it had taken this long. Eric closed the folder and rested both hands upon it. Harold never expected perfection, he said. He expected self-awareness. Families make mistakes. Healthy families recognize them. Avery opened her mouth as though preparing another explanation, but no words came. For the first time since I had known her, she appeared uncertain of what to say next. The confidence that had carried her through the evening seemed to have disappeared beneath the weight of accumulated facts. Eric turned toward me. Anna. Harold included one final personal message addressed only to you. However, before I read it, there remains one legal matter that everyone present must hear. I blinked in surprise. Harold had written something specifically for me after all these years. My heart tightened with anticipation, but Eric carefully raised one hand, signaling that the order of events mattered. The trust document requires that the identity of its controlling trustee be announced before the personal letter is delivered. A soft breath escaped several people around the table. Jaden looked toward me. Mary tightened her grip on my hand. Avery sat perfectly motionless, her eyes fixed on the folder resting beneath Eric's fingertips. Eric slowly opened it once more, removed a single notarized page, and said in an even voice, "The decision Harold made cannot be changed, cannot be negotiated, and became legally effective the moment this Christmas gathering began." Eric adjusted his glasses one final time before looking around the room with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his entire career delivering facts rather than opinions. "I am now reading the final appointment exactly as Harold Wright signed it," he said. Every guest remained perfectly still. Even the crackling fireplace seemed distant. I felt Mary's hand wrapped gently around mine, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. Jaden leaned forward in his chair, while Avery sat perfectly upright, her expression frozen somewhere between confidence and uncertainty. Eric unfolded the notarized page and began reading. Upon completion of the observation period, and following the annual Christmas family gathering designated within this instrument, all authority to administer, direct, approve, suspend, or modify distributions from the Wright Family Trust shall immediately vest in Anna Wright. For several seconds, nobody reacted. The word seemed too large to settle all at once. Then Eric calmly repeated the final sentence. Anna Wright is the sole controlling trustee. A collective breath escaped around the table. Avery blinked twice before speaking. There has to be some mistake. Her voice remained controlled, but the certainty that had carried her throughout the evening was gone. Eric slowly shook his head. There is no mistake. Jaden looked toward me with complete disbelief. Mom. Dad chose you? I nodded almost imperceptibly. I did not know he had. That answer surprised everyone, including Avery. She stared at me as though trying to determine whether I had been hiding some elaborate plan. The truth was much simpler. Harold had never discussed this decision with me. He had trusted Eric to carry out his wishes when the proper time arrived. Avery leaned forward. Surely Jaden and I are still managing everything together. We have been handling the family finances, the properties, and the household for years. Eric answered with remarkable patience. You have been assisting with day-to-day responsibilities. Beginning tonight, every significant financial decision regarding the trust requires Anna's authorization. The words settled over the room like fresh snow. No one interrupted. One of Jaden's business associates quietly set his water glass onto the table. Another guest lowered her eyes toward her plate. Everyone understood they were witnessing a moment that would permanently change the future of our family. Jaden rubbed his forehead slowly. Dad never mentioned any of this. Eric gave a thoughtful nod. Harold believed that authority should be earned through character rather than expected through inheritance. Jaden remained silent after that. I could see years of memories moving behind his eyes. He was remembering birthdays, holidays, ordinary dinners, and perhaps asking himself questions he had never considered before. I did not blame him. Grief has a way of narrowing a person's vision until they fail to notice what is happening directly beside them. Avery forced another smile, although this one appeared almost fragile. Well, she said carefully, if Anna is the trustee, then naturally we will all continue making decisions together as a family. Eric looked directly at her. That possibility is entirely within Anna's discretion. Those words changed everything. For the first time all evening, no one looked toward Avery before speaking. Every eye slowly turned toward me. Instead, the shift was subtle, almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore. I felt no triumph. Only an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Harold had not given me control as a reward. He had entrusted me with protecting the family he loved. Those were two very different things. Mary squeezed my hand again and whispered softly enough that only I could hear. Grandma. Grandpa knew. I looked at her and smiled through eyes that had suddenly grown warm. Yes, I whispered back. I think he did. Eric reached for another sealed envelope that had remained beneath the legal documents. Unlike the official papers, this envelope showed signs of age. The edges had softened over time, and Harold's familiar handwriting stretched neatly across the front. Only 3 words appeared there. For Anna. My heart tightened the instant I recognized his handwriting. It had been 4 years since I had last received anything written by him. Eric held the envelope carefully between both hands. This letter, he said, was never intended for the trust records. Harold asked that it be delivered only after Anna became trustee, and only after the appointment had been announced in front of the family. No one moved. Avery stared silently at the envelope. Jaden lowered his eyes. Mary smiled through tears she was trying very hard to hide. Eric stepped away from the table and slowly walked toward me. When he reached my side, he placed the envelope gently into my hands. Harold told me, Eric said quietly enough that the room almost had to lean forward to hear him, that when you finally opened this letter, you would understand why he had been preparing for this Christmas long before anyone else realized it was coming. My hands trembled ever so slightly as I looked down at the envelope Harold had addressed to me years before. I traced my fingertips across the familiar handwriting without opening it. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the reality settle into my heart. It felt as though my husband had somehow reached across time to place one final reassuring hand on my shoulder. The room remained silent. Nobody urged me to hurry. Even the guests who had arrived knowing almost nothing about our family understood that this moment belonged to something far deeper than money. Eric waited patiently beside me. Harold instructed me that you should read it whenever you are ready, he said softly. I nodded my thanks, carefully slipped the envelope into my purse, and looked around the room. I think he would want everyone to finish Christmas dinner before anything else, I said. My voice remained calm, although emotion rested just beneath every word. Eric smiled gently. That sounds exactly like something Harold would have hoped to hear. Across the room Jaden slowly stood and walked toward me. For several seconds he simply looked at me, searching my face as though seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Mom, he said quietly, I am sorry. There were no excuses. No explanations. Just 2 simple words. I placed my hand against his arm. Thank you for saying them. Neither of us pretended that 2 words could erase years of quiet distance. Healing rarely begins with solutions. It begins with honesty. Avery remained seated at the dining table, staring silently at the trust documents resting in front of Eric. She finally rose and approached us with measured steps. Her polished confidence had softened into something more uncertain. Anna, she began carefully, I truly never imagined tonight would become this. I looked at her without anger. Neither did I. She hesitated before continuing. If I made you feel unwelcome. Her sentence faded before reaching its conclusion. It was the closest she had come all evening to acknowledging what had happened. Eric remained respectfully silent. He understood that apologies lose meaning when someone else supplies the missing words. Avery lowered her eyes for a moment. I should have treated you differently. The admission was quiet, almost reluctant, but it was real. I appreciated the honesty more than any polished speech. You cannot change tonight, I answered gently. Neither can I. We can only decide what tomorrow looks like. My response surprised even me. Earlier that evening I had imagined leaving the house quietly, carrying another invisible wound back to an empty home. Instead, I found myself standing in the center of a conversation Harold had carefully prepared years before. Halfway across the room one of the family friends spoke. Anna, congratulations. I smiled politely but shook my head. This is not something to celebrate. Harold trusted me with a responsibility, not a prize. Eric nodded with quiet approval. That distinction, he said, is exactly why Harold chose as he did. Those words settled over the room with remarkable clarity. Suddenly I understood something my husband had been trying to teach throughout our marriage. Leadership was never about having the final word. It was about protecting the people who could not always protect themselves. Mary walked over carrying the watercolor set I had wrapped for her. Grandma, she said with a bright but emotional smile, can I open your present now? I laughed softly for what felt like the first time that evening. Of course you can. She carefully untied the ribbon instead of tearing the paper. Harold had always done the same thing. When she lifted the wooden art case from the box, her eyes filled with excitement. This is exactly what I wanted. She hugged me tightly, and for the first time that Christmas, the room felt genuinely warm. Watching her happiness reminded me that generosity had never depended upon legal documents or family trusts. It had always lived inside ordinary moments shared with love. Eric quietly gathered the official papers into his briefcase while everyone gradually relaxed enough to begin opening gifts. Conversation slowly returned, although nothing felt quite the same. The invisible lines that had separated the room only an hour earlier had begun to disappear. As I watched Jaden help Mary clear wrapping paper from the floor, I noticed Avery standing alone beside the fireplace. She looked toward me several times before finally walking over. Anna, she said almost in a whisper, there is something Eric has not told everyone yet, is there? I looked at her with mild surprise. Why would you think that? She glanced toward the envelope resting safely inside my purse. Because Harold was always one step ahead, and somehow I have the feeling that letter is not the last thing he planned for this family. I smiled gently at Avery's question and rested one hand on my purse where Harold's letter remained unopened. I do not know what is inside, I answered honestly. But I spent 43 years married to your father-in-law. I learned long ago that he never confused money with wisdom. Avery lowered her eyes and gave a slow nod. There was no argument left in her voice. Only quiet reflection. Eric finished placing the trust documents inside his briefcase before walking over to me one final time. Anna, he said warmly, Harold gave me one additional instruction if tonight unfolded as he believed it might. I looked at him with curiosity. He asked me to remind you that leadership begins the morning after the difficult conversation, not during it. I smiled through tears that refused to fall. That sounds exactly like Harold. Eric placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder before quietly saying goodbye to the family. One by one, the guests also began preparing to leave. Several stopped to thank me for the evening, although I had hosted nothing. Their kindness reminded me that people often learn the truth about a family not from its happiest moments but from the way it responds when uncomfortable truths finally surface. After the last guest departed, the house became wonderfully quiet. The Christmas lights continued glowing across the tree while soft instrumental music still played in the background. Jaden stood near the fireplace for several long moments before finally walking toward me again. Mom, he said, I keep thinking about all the holidays I should have noticed. I looked at my son, no longer seeing the successful businessman everyone else admired. I saw the little boy who used to help Harold carry ornaments down from the attic every December. Sometimes, I said gently, people do not notice what disappears until someone points to the empty space. He nodded slowly. I should have protected you. I shook my head. You should have seen me. Protection usually begins there. He quietly wiped at his eyes before embracing me for the first time in longer than I could remember. It was not a dramatic moment. It was simply honest. And honesty is where families begin finding one another again. Avery remained standing a respectful distance away until Jaden stepped back. She approached more slowly than she ever had before. There was no polished smile. No perfect posture. Only humility. "Anna," she said softly, "I spent so much time trying to become the center of this family that I forgot who helped build it." I listened without interrupting. "I cannot change what I did," she continued. "But if you ever decide to give me another chance, I would like to earn it instead of expecting it." I appreciated that she did not ask for forgiveness as though it could be granted in a single evening. Trust grows slowly. It deserves time. "Tomorrow," I said, "we will have breakfast together. No guests. No speeches. No lawyers. Just conversation." Relief crossed her face. "I would like that very much." Mary came running into the room carrying a framed family photograph she had found upstairs. It had been taken nearly 20 years earlier. Harold stood in the center with one arm around Jaden and the other around me. There was no wealth visible in that picture. No elegant decorations. No expensive clothing. Only smiles. Mary placed the photograph on the mantel above the fireplace. "Grandpa should be here with us," she whispered. I looked at the picture for a long time before answering. "In some ways, sweetheart, he still is." A week later I met with Eric to begin reviewing the responsibilities of the Wright Family Trust. I made my first decision immediately. The trust would continue supporting the charities Harold and I had loved together. Scholarships would remain fully funded. Employees at our family businesses would keep the retirement program Harold had created years before. Nothing changed simply because authority had changed hands. My second decision was more personal. I established a family council that would meet every quarter, not to discuss money first, but to discuss relationships. Financial reports could wait. Honest conversations could not. Jaden attended every meeting. Avery attended every meeting as well. She listened far more than she spoke. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, small habits began changing. Invitations became intentional. Every holiday table included a place for everyone before decorations were arranged. Family photographs were never started until the entire family had gathered. Those gestures appeared insignificant to anyone outside our home, yet I understood they were the true inheritance Harold had hoped to preserve. The following Christmas looked very different from the one that had changed our lives. There was laughter again, but this time nobody stood alone near the wall. Before dinner began, Jaden pulled out the chair beside his own and smiled. "Mom, your place has been waiting for you all day." I sat beside my son while Mary reached across the table to hold my hand. Avery quietly placed Harold's favorite cranberry recipe in front of me. "I thought perhaps we could make it together this year," she said. I smiled and nodded. Outside, fresh snow covered the front lawn exactly as it had the year before, but inside the house everything felt different. Harold had once told me that fortunes could build beautiful homes, but only kindness could build families worth coming home to. Looking around that table, I finally understood that the greatest gift he left behind was never the trust, the properties, or the wealth. It was the chance to remember that no one who helped build a family should ever be made to feel invisible again.